I have been on record before saying that 2020 is the greatest year in gaming history. There was just modern classic after modern classic that year. Well, 2020 is a very unconventional pick. Most people will tell you 2018, or 2007, or 2004. Well, my next pick isn't one of those either. That goes to 2017, which is the most underrated year in gaming history. After all, there are 4 games that came out this year, where if you told me they are the greatest game of all time, I would not argue with you at all. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Let's explore 2017 in gaming. You don't have to go too deep into the year before you find your first banger game. On January 24th, Resident Evil 7 Biohazard dropped. Now, Resident Evil 7 is a great game on its own, but it's even more monumental given some context. At the time 7 released, Capcom was seen as sort of a fading giant in the industry, similarly to how Ubisoft is viewed now. Additionally, Resident Evil was viewed in a similar light, with all the recent releases being received pretty poorly. Well, Resident Evil 7 changed everything. It was loved by critics and gamers alike, and essentially saved the reputation of both Capcom and Resident Evil in one fell swoop. Capcom, of course, went on to make many more bangers for years to come, and even in the Resident Evil series, there's been so many great entries since 7. The game itself was the first ever first-person Resident Evil game, which helped modernize the series. It also returned to being a more horror-focused game after the more recent entries at the time had been more action-focused. So, all in all, a great game with a greater impact on gaming for years to come. If Resident Evil 7 wasn't so good, we wouldn't have gotten Resident Evil 4 Remake. It goes without saying that not every release will be as monumental as Resident Evil 7, but throughout the video, I'll pepper in some good, solid games that released. Like Nioh. Nioh is a Souls-like which initially released as a PS4 exclusive on February 7th. It was received pretty well and later received a sequel in 2020 which was even better. Later that month, on the 24th, our first all-timer dropped. Hollow Knight is the greatest indie game of all time, the greatest 2D platformer of all time, and arguably the greatest game of all time. It started development 3 years earlier in 2014 by the Australian studio Team Cherry, and it came out to moderate success, although it really picked up steam the next year when it received console ports. What makes Hollow Knight so good is its world. It's so well connected and never feels overwhelming despite how big it is. The bosses are all phenomenal and provide a great challenge without at any point feeling out of reach or too hard. Another major area in which Hollow Knight shines is the charm system. Equipping different charms will apply different abilities to your character. It could be anything from more damage or more health to an entire partner character. They allow for each playthrough to feel completely different and so much creativity in how you build your character. And the best part is that you're never locked into any build. You can change out your charms super quickly at damn near any time in the game. And to tie a neat little bow on the entire thing, the game looks stunning with its hand-drawn art style. Hollow Knight is in my top 10 games of all time and is truly a masterpiece. It's also, somehow, the 3rd best game of 2017. So imagine this, right? Arguably, the greatest game of all time drops on Friday, right? Surely, we can go a week without a better game coming out, right? Oh, darn it, we missed one. Now, Horizon Zero Dawn gets a pretty bad reputation these days, as Sony has really shoved the series down people's throats. But it's a pretty solid game. Oh, who am I kidding? Breath of the Wild came out on Friday. When Breath of the Wild came out, I was in 5th grade. At that time, my favorite game was either Mario 64 or Mario Kart Wii. I can't remember which one. But when I played Breath of the Wild, it was raps. I have played all the way through this game at least 5 times. And it's a long-ass game, too. Breath of the Wild was the greatest game of all time when it released. Hands down, in my opinion. It's an absolute masterpiece, perfect across the board. I mean, there's not really much I can say that hasn't already been said. I love this game so much. I even bought it for full retail price 3 times! Wowzers, we are really on a hot streak here. Surely we can go another week without another all-timer coming out. I think you can see where this is going. Nier Automata came out the next Tuesday and is considered by many people to be one of the greatest games of all time. Let's go back in time to 2010. The first Nier was released on PS3 and 360 and received middling reviews. This was in large part due to the gameplay being kinda mid, and in spite of this mid gameplay, the game was beloved by gamers. When it was time for a sequel, the development was done by Platinum Games, one of the most beloved developers in the industry. Well, the end result was phenomenal. It mixes the stylish and smooth combat standard for Platinum Games with everything people loved about the original. A phenomenal soundtrack with one of the most unique and beloved stories in gaming history. Now, if you thought we were done with the weekly all-time games, you would be right. With that being said, Rain World came out towards the end of March, and it's not a world beater by any means, but it's a solid indie platformer release. Now, we have gone about 3 full weeks without an all-time game releasing. That's not good. Well, luckily for us, my favorite game of all time, and one of the best games of all time, came out on April 4th. Persona 5 is my favorite game of all time, specifically the Royal version, but we can let this one slide for the video. I have talked so extensively about why I love this game many times before on the channel, so I'll give it a rest here, but just know, it's the greatest thing ever made. Okay, no more fake outs. We're actually done for a while with the all-time game releases, but here are a couple quick shout-outs of games that released throughout the spring and the summer that deserve to be mentioned at least. What Remains of Edith Finch is a rare instance of a game that has the ability to have a pretty solid impact despite being as short as it is. It's a walking sim that's not boring somehow. Mario Kart 8 Deluxe came out 4 days later and it sold a couple copies. It's not my favorite Mario Kart, but it's undeniably an important game for the Switch, and it's packed with a ton of content. It's pretty solid. The first Little Nightmares came out the same day as Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. It's a horror puzzle platformer which has since spawned 2 more entries in the series, one of which is probably coming out in a month or so when you're watching this. Skipping ahead a few months brings us to the one and only Splatoon 2. Splatoon 2 continues the Nintendo onslaught that happened this year. It's a very solid third-person shooter, and it's also completely irrelevant when talking about third-person shooters that released between July 21st and July 25th of 2017, but we can circle back to that. Let's finish our little spree here. In early August, Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice released. Despite not being a AAA release, it was groundbreaking graphically. It took inspiration from a lot of contemporary third-person adventure games and released to a pretty decent success. A week or so later, Sonic Mania released and was quickly considered the best Sonic game of the modern era, finally not being mid. Mario + Rabbids Kingdom Battle came out a few weeks later, and despite sounding like the worst idea for a game ever, it was actually pretty solid. And that's it for August, but Metroid Samus Returns came out another few weeks later, and was the long-awaited return of the Metroid series after 7 years of absence. And no, we don't count Federation Force around here. Exactly a week later, Doki Doki Literature Club released, and it was a pretty big internet sensation at the time. The game still remains fairly popular to this day as a dating visual novel game turned psychological horror. That genre combination really sounds like bananas and Sprite, huh? Our final game of the little spree here is Danganronpa V3, a much better visual novel than DDLC, and part of one of my favorite video game series of all time. And with that, we have reached the next landmark release, which came out on September 29th, so let's circle back to the other third-person shooter of July 21st through July 25th of 2017. Now, Fortnite as we know it today was of course not released in 2017. However, that does not change the fact that it was initially launched in July of 2017. It was initially a PvE shooter, but the PvP elements were introduced a couple months later in September, which were mainly to drive players to the PvE mode. And of course, that afterthought PvP mode that they introduced simply to drive players to their PvE mode ended up being the most popular video game of all time. Fortnite Battle Royale took over the world in late 2017 and went on to have the biggest peak of any game ever. I was in 6th grade during the peak of Fortnite, and literally every person in school was playing it and talking about it, and the vibes were so good. And as they say, 2017 through 2018 Fortnite is the closest we have gotten to world peace. Prime Fortnite is easily the greatest online game of all time, as well as the most popular online game of all time. This is the final 2017 release where if you told me it is the greatest game of all time, I can't argue with that. Alrighty, let's zoom back ahead to our current spot in time with the one and only Cuphead being released on September 29th. Famously, Cuphead was initially intended to be a 2016 release, but the increasing scope of the game and the struggles that came along with that pushed it to 2017. Cuphead is a 2D platformer and boss rush type of game. It's infamous for its difficulty. It released to a ton of success. People loved the game and it was selling like crazy. The tight controls and variety in playstyles the game offers are fantastic, as well as the beautiful art style, which was inspired by 1930s cartoons. It's one of the greatest indie games of all time and was yet another release that is an all-time great out of 2017. And a little less than another week later, we had another indie platformer release with A Hat in Time. Now, A Hat in Time is no Cuphead, but it's still a good time. It's a 3D indie platformer, so it's a bit more rare in that sense. They're usually 2D sprite-based games. It was a pretty successful game, but another pretty decent 3D platformer released about 3 weeks later. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you our final turbo game of the video, Super Mario Odyssey. Super Mario Odyssey was the first true 3D Mario game since Galaxy 2 released back in 2010. Yeah, there were some 3D Mario games, but they were no Galaxy or Odyssey. I would say from my personal experience that Odyssey is what sealed the deal for the Switch's success. Nintendo already had so many other successful releases in 2017 between Breath of the Wild, ARMS, Splatoon 2, Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, Mario & Rabbids, and even Xenoblade Chronicles in December, but Mario Odyssey was the one. It was incredibly popular on release, and this was the game that really made the general gaming audience kind of forget that the Wii U ever happened. It could not have reviewed much better than it did, and in some people's opinion, it's the greatest Mario game of all time. The amount of movement options and breathtaking levels here are astonishing. It's simply a masterpiece and puts a nice little bow on the entire year. Mario Odyssey was the final truly notable game release in 2025. Of course, we did have Xenoblade 2, but other than that, the rest of the releases for the holiday season would give you a sense of pride and accomplishment at best. With that being said, let's see what happened at the Game Awards that year. The Game of the Year was Breath of the Wild. I can't argue with that. Mine's Persona 5, but it's also my favorite game of all time versus my second favorite game of all time, so I can't really complain either way. Best art direction was Cuphead. Should have been Persona 5, but, okay. Best score was Nier Automata. Again, should have been Persona 5, but okay. Best action game was Wolfenstein 2. Now this is what you call a pity award right here. Best indie game should have been Hollow Knight, and Mario Odyssey won Best Family Game despite being a single-player game. I'm just joking with all the Game Awards stuff. I mean, that's just my opinion, but I don't really care too much. None of these picks are that bad, besides Wolfenstein 2. But all in all, I think I've actually convinced myself that 2017 is the best year in gaming history. I mean, what are the odds that 3 of my 10 favorite games of all time released within 39 days of each other?